A number of years ago, I was talking with a friend of mine named Ed. We were talking about this story from John, and the conversation shifted to our thoughts about the difference between hired hands and owners. Ed then recalled the time he and his friend, Tommy Brannan, went duck hunting on a river. They had been out all day in Tommy's boat, sharing equally in the pleasure of it, when it came time at last to pack up and go home. Motoring back to the launch pad, they heaved the prow of the boat up on the riverbank and began to haul their guns and decoys back to the car. On their second trip back to the river, however, the boat was gone. Looking downstream, they saw it floating away about 10 feet from the bank. So they dropped everything and ran after it, crashing through the underbrush to draw even with it, but the closer they got, the further it moved out into the main current of the river. First 10 feet, then 12, then 20 feet, gaining speed as it went. Finally came the moment of truth. As cold and tired as they both were, it was clear that one of them would have to strip and swim after the boat. They looked at each other and they both knew who it would be. "It wasn't my boat," Ed said. But he helped out by cheering for Tommy as he tore off his camouflage jumpsuit and dove into the river. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. That's what makes him good, according to John's story. His willingness to get involved, to risk his life for the life of his flock. His flock, not somebody else's flock, which he gets paid a few dollars an hour to look after, but his own flock, the one he has bought and bred, doctored, and protected. He's invested in it in more ways than one. His sheep are his livelihood, for one thing, but they're also his extended family. They know his voice, his touch, his walk. If they're grazing with 1,000 other sheep and he calls them, they will separate themselves from the crowd and follow him home. His flute is the sound of safety for them, the sound of still waters and green pastures. He knows them too by name and their disposition. There's Houdini, who is always escaping through some hole in the fence. There's Pegleg, who limps from the time she stepped in a hole. There's Bossy, who likes nothing better than butting heads. There's something about ownership that creates intimacy, especially ownership of living things. A dog or a cat can become a soul friend who knows how we're feeling when no one else does. I remember I had a cat named Bing who was my spiritual director. When I was frantic, she would go to sleep in my lap. When I was sad, she would leap out at me from dark corners. When I was fine, Bing would take a break and go off to do things on her own. Some people say we pick pets who look like us. If it's true because they really are extensions of us, creatures who are so much a part of our lives that sometimes it's not easy to tell who owns whom. And ownership isn't just a matter of legal title. We've all heard people talk about owning their feelings or owning up to a problem. When I hear expressions like that, and when I put them together with the story of the Good Shepherd, I begin to think of ownership as a certain kind of relationship, one that's created between people and other people, or animals, or things. Then ownership becomes something more, It becomes about being bound to something beyond ourselves, about identifying with it so strongly that it becomes part of us. When it's threatened, we defend it as if we were defending our own bodies, and sometimes that can get us into trouble. I remember my cousin telling me about visiting a friend of hers once in California. They met at the airport, and as they were getting into the car to leave, my cousin opened her door so wide that it whacked the side view mirror of a red sports car parked next to it. There was no harm done, but the owner of the sports car happened to be sitting inside at the time, and when she heard the whack, she exploded out of the driver's door. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she yelled at my cousin. At which point my cousin's friend jumped out of the car and said, "Don't you talk to her like that. It was an accident. You can see for yourself that nothing's broken." "I'm talking to her, not you, honey," the woman said furiously. "Well, when you're talking to her, you're talking to me," said my cousin's friend. And the other woman backed down. Say what you will about brawls in airport parking lots, there is ownership in that statement. When you're talking to her, you're talking to me. There is intimate relationship in that. The full willingness to risk one's own safety in order to defend someone else's. Not because she can't take care of herself, but because you care for her. You're connected to her, and you know it. All in all, we're warned away from getting involved in other people's problems. Parents teach us to mind our own business, let other people mind theirs. Therapists call it trespassing boundaries or codependence. They have a point. Sometimes our ownership of others' problems ends up crippling both them and us by eroding our responsibility for our own lives. When we make a habit of rescuing other people, we prevent them from learning about the consequences of their actions. We help them keep their illusions about themselves, and we get to be heroes in the bargain, but it's not good for them or for us. Everybody deserves a chance to fail. It's how we learn to be human. But we also deserve to have someone in our lives who will say, when you're talking to her, you're talking to me. Someone who will tear her clothes off and dive into the water when what is disappearing down the river happens to be us. That isn't codependence. That's agape, self-giving love. The kind of love the Good Shepherd practices, the kind the Good Shepherd teaches. If the shepherd had been a hired hand, we wouldn't even know his name. A hired hand would have taken one look at the wolf, or Tommy's boat floating down the river, or the bully who went after my cousin, and the hired hand would have vanished. If he'd been a religious hired hand, before he disappeared, he might have stopped long enough to say, "God bless you, I'll pray for you." But he definitely wouldn't have stayed to help, because a hired hand doesn't care for the sheep. He doesn't own them, so he doesn't involve himself so deeply in their lives that he risks his own to protect theirs. He minds his business, takes care of himself. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. But then, what happens to the sheep? Who protects them after he's dead? Well, this is what happens. On the night before he died, They all fell asleep after a big meal, with the sound of the shepherd's flute in their ears. And as they slept, they shared a terrible dream about wolves with clubs and torches who came out of the woods, led their shepherd away, and tore him to shreds on a hillside outside of town. In the dream, they huddled for safety, unable to think, unable to move. And they stayed that way for 3 whole days, wondering if they would starve to death before the wolves came back to finish the job. But then, on the 3rd day, they heard a flute, far away at first, then drawing nearer. It woke them from their sleep, and they stood once again in the presence of their good shepherd. Everything was the same again, but everything had changed. Looking around at each other, they saw what had happened. They had fallen asleep as sheep, but they had woken up as shepherds. As they slept, every one of them had been changed into the image of their good shepherd. And as they stood there, staring at one another, he handed them staves like his and flutes, and sent them out to gather their own flocks. "Do for them as I did for you," he said. For most of us, loving our neighbor really doesn't ask that much of us. It involves something less, something like donning a mask and adhering to public health guidelines during a pandemic. It asks us to do things like take an honest accounting of policing in America and make substantive changes in recruitment, training, and retention of individual officers, and funding of resources to address public safety without holding on to the policies and procedures that were birthed out of racial discrimination. For countless essential workers in our country, it has meant risking personal safety and security and caring for COVID patients, providing services to grieving families, and ensuring that the rest of us with the privilege to shelter at home have the goods and services we need to survive during a pandemic. Still, we see the wolves and the hired hands among us who either flaunt the necessary precautions in favor of a vaulted notion of individual liberty, or who try to take advantage of the trials imposed by the pandemic upon our lives. There is a difference between those who follow the lead of the Good Shepherd and those who don't. At the same time, Jesus doesn't idealize laying down his life. Neither did the early church. I've been thinking about that, about the elevation of the cross over the empty tomb as the symbol of faith in Christ. Have you ever noticed how many of our sanctuaries have a depiction of the resurrection equivalent to the representation of Jesus' death? Why is the violence of his death easier to embrace than the glory of his life? In the midst of the trial of the murder of George Floyd, yet another police officer killed an unarmed black man, Daunte Wright, in a nearby community. The devastation expressed by his family and the people of Minneapolis remind us how much pain and turmoil ripples from the actions of a few. But there's a larger problem for me in all of that. It's about suffering, and the suffering that I see often glorified, not only in life itself, but even in the church. Suffering was never meant to be glorified, even as it was often acknowledged as part of the human condition that needs to be overcome. Yet, we glorify suffering rather than condemn the injustices that lead to it. I remember watching a video of the renowned theologian James Cone, in which he said that Jesus failed. The audience listening to him primarily comprised of African American pastors, scholars, and denominational leaders. They gasped. I was shocked by the statement myself. Cone said that Jesus failed, but that God took that failure and transformed that failure through resurrection. So many of our hymns and liturgies reinforce the death of Christ as the defining action, but it was the precursor. It's the resurrection, the taking back up of that sacrificed life in a transformed way that makes the difference. The death of Christ means nothing without the resurrection. The laying down that Jesus refers to in this story is not so much the cross as the incarnation. Did Jesus want the human life so badly that giving that life up meant such a sacrifice? Or did laying down his divinity and all the privileges of that life represent the laying down that he mentions in our story? When Jesus invites us to lay down our lives, maybe he's asking us to examine our places of privilege and lay them down as well. Maybe the sacrifice asked of us is to give up a way of life that depends upon the oppression and marginalization of others. In the past 2 centuries, many Western countries have become more diverse, ethnically, religiously, culturally, linguistically. Some see this development as disturbing. Others see the diversity as enriching and exciting. We spread the good news, I believe, by being the good news, by loving our neighbors, honoring the full diversity of humanity, including theological perspectives. This is laying down one's life, like the Good Shepherd. Jesus is the Good Shepherd because of his relationship with God, a relationship involving the specific mission of laying down his life on behalf of the sheep. On the surface, this sacrifice would appear to leave the flock more vulnerable than ever. But maybe that's not the case, because the Good Shepherd will continue guiding the flock and bringing others into the fold, because he has the power both to lay his life down and to take it up again. The resurrection repudiates the crucifixion. That horrible, violent death didn't have the final word. Life prevails. The Good Shepherd lives. Laying down his life was a choice Jesus had submitted himself to, but taking it back up was also a choice. The Good Shepherd got back up. The cross was part of the journey. The resurrected life was the destination. For Jesus, for us, for all of creation. The Good Shepherd lives when love becomes more than what we feel and is manifested in what we do and how we live. The Good Shepherd lives when we eschew calling for calm during civil unrest in favor of reaching for justice. The Good Shepherd lives when Black, brown, Asian, and indigenous lives matter as much as white lives matter. The Good Shepherd lives when our transgender siblings enjoy full rights of citizenship and valued personhood. The Good Shepherd lives when we welcome the immigrant and the stranger among us. The Good Shepherd lives when people are paid a living wage, enabling them to feed their families, live in their homes, pay their bills. The Good Shepherd lives when people have access to quality health care. The Good Shepherd lives when our love is a verb, when it takes action, takes flight, when it works and serves on the behalf of others. Do for them as I did for you, he said. Do for them as I did for you. Thanks be to God. Amen.